This lecture deals with part 1 of 2 of the Reconstruction time period in the post-Civil War era. So in several ways, the United States victory over the South in the Civil War is a great thing, but there's a lot of work to be done in this period after the war. The human toll of the Civil War was enormous. 364,000 Northerners will lose their lives, and another 260,000 Southerners will lose their lives. Between 1865 and 1877, the federal government carried out this program to repair the damage and restore and build a new country after the Civil War called Reconstruction. Freedmen, which were the freed slaves, were starting out their new lives in a poor region with slow economic activity. After the South was destroyed by the Civil War, plantation owners lost slave labor worth $3 billion. Poor white Southerners could not find work because of new job competition with the freed men. And the war had destroyed 2/3 of the South's shipping industry and about 9,000 miles of railroad. So there is a lot of work to be done to ensure that this country will be successful in the post-Civil War era. So early on in the end of the Civil War, Congress creates the Freedmen's Bureau, which was going to help former slaves get a new start in life, and it's the first major relief agency in United States history. So what did they try to do? They helped African Americans to help find them jobs. Most of them only had the skill of working on a farm. They built thousands of schools to try to educate all ages of African Americans. Former slaves were rushing to get an education, especially for their children. And prior to the war, education was so difficult and dangerous to gain because Southerners hated the idea that freedmen would be armed with knowledge. So it was legal to teach them to read or write in many Southern states. So we kind of got to get these people caught up with their education, with their skills. So it's not only primary or secondary education, it's also colleges are created. You start to see many African American colleges forming all around the South as African Americans are getting educated, feeling that they need to expand their education through college or university. So prior to Lincoln's assassination, he comes up with a plan for Reconstruction. He wanted a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction in December of 1863, and he gave forgiveness to those who pledged Union loyalty and support for emancipation. So amnesty meaning not only are you forgiven, but the crime acts like it never happened, and we're going to reconstruct the country. He said when 10% of the voters had taken the oath of allegiance to the United States, the new state government could be organized. So that means literally 90% of the state could disagree with Lincoln, and they could still be brought back into the Union. The new government was required to ban slavery, but that was it, because we don't have the 14th or 15th Amendment yet. The plan for readmission was called the 10% plan, because of 10% of the population. In opposition to Lincoln is mostly in Congress. So in 1864, Congress writes up its own plan called the Wade-Davis Bill. It said the majority of white male citizens would be required to take a loyalty oath before elections could be held. So we go from 10% to 51%. Lincoln has killed the bill using his pocket veto, meaning if it passed in the last 10 days of the legislative session. So since the Congress gets a break after that legislative session, if they don't pass the bill dies. So he doesn't support it, he doesn't oppose it, he just lets it die. So we already see there's competition. We have the executive branch with Lincoln trying to do Reconstruction. We have Congress trying to do Reconstruction, and we also have differences of opinion. Congress is trying to make it more difficult. Lincoln is trying to make it simpler. So after Lincoln is assassinated, President Andrew Johnson takes over. He remains loyal to the Union during the Civil War, and he chose him as his vice president in the election of 1864 because he would help with the Southern Reconstruction. So he supports Lincoln's plan. And he is going to try to do what the then dead president wanted. So he engages in a power struggle with Congress over who would lead the country over Reconstruction, executive branch or legislative branch, and eventually would be impeached, which means charges were brought up against him, but he's not removed from office. So he's going to be kind of a lame duck president and only serve out the rest of Lincoln's term until 1868. So Lincoln is going to not see this, but we will know it's going to happen by the time of his death, the 13th Amendment. So it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whether the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. So it emancipates the slaves completely with one stroke of the pen. It does leave it open that like slave labor can be used by criminals, which is maybe more of an issue today, but for the most part slavery is destroyed by the 13th Amendment, which is the first of our 3 Reconstruction Amendments. So again, presidential Reconstruction was this period where either Lincoln or Johnson was pushing the idea of amnesty. Rebels would sign an oath of allegiance, especially high-ranking Confederate officials, and they would be not only forgiven, but we would act like the whole secession never happened. They would have to write new constitutions that improved the 13th Amendment, reject secession and states' rights, and submit to U.S. government authority. There is no mention of education for freedmen or the Freedmen's Bureau or the 14th or 15th Amendments at this point. So as Southerners are starting to see what's going to happen in Reconstruction, they start to enact black codes, which were legal laws that restricted certain people's freedom. So they established virtual slavery with different provisions that we will talk about. So even though they're freed as slaves, they're not necessarily granted that freedom by Southerners. So there were curfews. Generally, black people could not gather after sunset. And as long as it applied to all of them, it was okay. Vagrancy laws, freedmen were convicted of vagrancy, that is not working, could be fined, whipped, or sold for a year's labor, so sold basically back into slavery for a year. They had different labor contracts where freedmen had to sign agreements in January for a year of work, and those who quit in the middle of the contract lost all the wages they had earned up to that point. There was also land restrictions, where freed people could not rent land or homes only in rural areas, meaning that they had to live on plantations several times the plantations that they had actually been a slave on. So at this point, Reconstruction is not really working. Although they are free, they are not equal, and they are not really getting the benefits of no longer being slaves. So in 1866, we have a congressman quoted a Georgian saying, "Blacks eat, sleep, move, live only by the tolerance of whites who hate them. The blacks own absolutely nothing but their bodies. Their foreign masters own everything and will sell them nothing. If a black man draws even a bucket of water from a well, he must first get the permission of a white man, his enemy. If he asks for work to earn his living, he must ask it of a white man. And the whites are determined to give him no work except on such terms as will make him a serf and impair his liberty." So what this is saying is, even though they are free of slavery, they are not really equal in society. So the 13th Amendment is not doing enough. So in the Republican Party, we have a section called the Radical Republicans of Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Sumner was the man who was beaten by a cane after giving an anti-slavery speech. So they want to see the South punished for the Civil War. They are not in agreement with Lincoln of making this lenient. They advocated for political, social, and economic equality for these freed men, and they went after President Johnson through the impeachment process after he vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would try to expand civil rights for African Americans, not just the end of slavery. So congressional or radical Reconstruction was vastly different than presidential. They excused the Confederacy's war debt, but they barred prominent Confederates from holding political office, whether you were high-ranking in the Confederate Army or in the Confederate government. You had to write new state constitutions that not only ended slavery, but guaranteed the 14th and 15th Amendments, equality and citizenship and voting rights. You had to reject secession and states' rights, and Congress had to approve the new state constitutions before you could actually become a state. They also established the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, which divided the South into different military districts, and which allowed the military to protect these newly freed men, literally with kind of like a police force. So the governments of the South don't exist anymore. It's a military occupation of the South to ensure that these rights are protected. They would help the freedmen. They supported the Freedmen's Bureau, especially for education, and wanted to, they never actually get this, grant them 40 acres and a mule so a freedman could use his skills as that they learned in slavery of working in agriculture to kind of make their own way of life. So as we said, congressional Reconstruction was not just the 13th Amendment, but they had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which said all persons born in the United States are citizens of the country and the state they reside in. No state shall make or enforce any law which deprives any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction to the equal protection of the laws. And Congress could enforce this. So this is the more significant and the most significant Reconstruction Amendment that we get. It's more significant than 15th or 13th. The 14th Amendment is not only used for African Americans, it's used for any downtrodden group in American history from here on out. If they feel that they're being treated unequally in the eyes of the law and their rights are being taken away, they generally reference the 14th Amendment. So at this time, the women's rights movement is picking back up again with Susan B. Anthony, and she was a supporter of women's rights, and they refused to support the 14th Amendment giving African American men citizenship unless women were added to it. Abolitionists do not support this. They felt it was too much change at one time, and several abolitionists actually did not think that women were equal to men. So again, this really only applies to men at this point in history. Not only the 13th, the 13th abolished slavery for women and men, but the 14th and 15th really only applied to men. So this map shows you the military districts that the South is divided into, so it's not states. The date of readmission into the Union is shown in black, and the purple date is the date of radical Reconstruction government. So the defeat of the radical Reconstruction. So between those two dates is when radicals really take over and when we see most of the wins for the Reconstruction era. As the radicals lose power, most of the military districts go away, and the people who were generally former Confederates take over their states again. So Congress is able to do all these different Reconstruction acts because of one that is vetoed by President Johnson. So they wanted this Reconstruction Act or Civil Rights Act of 1866. So Johnson vetoes it. He kind of throws the three men kind of out the window, and he believed that Congress believed that Johnson was working against Reconstruction and overrides his veto. So it does go into effect. Eventually, President Johnson is impeached for a separate issue, which makes him kind of a lame duck president who does not have much power. So just to review this, in the Constitution, the president can be impeached, which means you bring charges against him. And there's two steps. The first step is the House of Representatives holds hearings to decide whether there were crimes committed. Then they vote on the charges, and if there is a majority, then the charges are brought against the president. So the first step is just to actually see if we're going to charge him with anything. The second step is that the U.S. Senate becomes the courtroom, and the president is tried for the charges brought against him. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the judge, and once the trial is completed, senators must vote to remove the president with a 2/3 majority, so 66 senators or more must vote to remove him, or 67, excuse me, and if they don't get that number, then he stays in office. So you can be impeached, which just means charges are brought up against you, but not removed from office, which is what happens to Johnson. So the way that they get this to happen is Johnson is brought up on 11 charges of high crimes and misdemeanors, mostly because of this Tenure of Office Act. It was a law that Congress passed that the president can't fire any of his cabinet members without consulting Congress first. They kind of knew that Johnson was looking to get rid of some of the cabinet members because it wasn't his cabinet, it was Lincoln's. He fires a man named Edward Stanton. So he has broken the law. Now, the law isn't really constitutional, but he does break the law that's there. So he missed being removed from office by one vote, so he is impeached, but he is not removed from office. But at this point, he's kind of a lame duck president, and he's a figurehead. It saves the separation of powers between the three branches of government, so that and Congress kind of really takes over Reconstruction from this point forward. So after this, they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, creating the military districts and all these different things. The South would be reconstructed under the Radical Reconstruction Plan. Congress would take over, not the executive branch. And eventually the Radical Republicans would elect Grant as their president, and he's going to carry out the Radical Reconstruction, which will actually be a problem because there's going to be a lot of controversy in his president, not dealing with Reconstruction, but dealing with kind of too much power in his cabinet. And the strong government of 1869 to 1877, Grant is enforcing the Reconstruction Act and forcing the South to change, so you can see the South will not take this too kindly. So this shows the final of the three Reconstruction Amendments, the 15th Amendment, which allows the right to voting to be given to African American men. Notice it says race and color or previous condition of servitude. It does not say anything about sex. Women will not be able to vote until the 19th Amendment is passed in the early 1900s. So you can see here are three amendments listed, their dates and their definitions, and it gave black men the right to vote was truly revolutionary. It's a victory for democracy, and this image is showing a very famous image of the first vote for African Americans. So not only do they actually vote, but they actually hold legislative elections for the first times in 1870. More than 600 African Americans were elected to the state legislatures. Louisiana had a black governor, and Hiram Revels from Mississippi becomes the first African American to be elected to the Senate. And you can see, so they're actually getting massive wins here. The New South, Congress, private investors, and heavy taxes paid for Reconstruction. So you're going to see a lot of wins here in the first section of Reconstruction.